If you drive along State Road 24 in rural Levy County, Florida, about 9 miles from the Gulf Coast town of Cedar Key, you will pass a single historical marker on the side of the road. If you blink, you will miss it. There is almost nothing else there, some trees, some scrub, a few scattered houses. You would never guess that anything had ever happened here at all. But a town stood on this ground once, a whole town, with homes and churches, and a school with families who had lived here for 3 generations, with businesses and farms and a Masonic hall and children playing in the yards, a prosperous, self-sufficient black town called Rosewood. And in the first week of January in 1923, a white mob burned it to the ground. They killed its people, drove the survivors into the freezing swamps in their night clothes, and destroyed every building until there was nothing left. The black families who fled that week never came back, not one of them. The town simply ceased to exist. And then something happened that is almost harder to comprehend than the massacre itself. America forgot. For 60 years, the destruction of Rosewood was erased so thoroughly from the record and from memory that most of the country had no idea it had ever taken place. Even the survivors scattered across Florida carried the secret in silence, too afraid to tell their own children what they had lived through. This is the story of Rosewood, and it is the story of a double erasure, of a town that was destroyed on purpose, and then of a memory that was buried on purpose, so that the crime could disappear as completely as the place. It is one of the darkest chapters in American history, but it does not end in the dark, and I want you to hold on to that as we go, because the way this story finally comes back into the light is one of the most important things that has ever happened in the long American struggle for justice. To understand all of it, you have to first understand what Rosewood was, because what was lost here was not just buildings, it was a whole world. Rosewood was settled back in 1845, and in its early years it was a mixed community, both black and white, built around the timber industry, specifically the cedar trees that grew thick in the area, which fed the pencil mills over in nearby Cedar Key. For decades, it was a working lumber town, but by around 1890, most of the cedar had been cut, the pencil mills closed, and the white residents largely moved a few miles west to the mill town of Sumner, where the work had gone. And so, by the turn of the 20th century, Rosewood had become something particular and precious, a predominantly black town, owned and run and inhabited by black families in the Jim Crow South. And it thrived. This was not a shanty town or a hardscrabble settlement. Rosewood was a real community of around 200 people, and by every account of the people who lived there and the historians who later reconstructed it, it was stable, self-sufficient, and in many cases genuinely prosperous. Families owned their own land, their own homes painted and neat, their own farms. There were 2 churches, an African Methodist Episcopal church and a Baptist church. There was a school. There was a Masonic lodge, a symbol of the community's organized, respectable, aspirational life. There were businesses, a general store, a sugarcane mill, and there was industry. Several of Rosewood's families worked in and even owned pieces of the naval stores business, the turpentine industry that was big money in that part of Florida. One family, the Goins family, had come down from a thriving lumber business in North Carolina and built a successful turpentine operation in Rosewood. They were among the wealthiest people in the town, black or white, for miles around. The Carrier family, the Hall family, the Bradley family, these were established, landowning, multi-generational black families who had built real lives and real security on this ground. Rosewood was, in other words, exactly the kind of place that the entire structure of the Jim Crow South was designed to make impossible, a community where black Americans were independent, prosperous, and free. And here's the detail that makes what happened so much more heartbreaking. For a long time, Rosewood and the white town of Sumner next door coexisted peacefully. Relations between the two communities were, by the historical accounts, relatively amicable. People traded and worked together, and in one small, human, almost unbearable detail that survivors remembered, some of the white boys from the surrounding area would come over to Rosewood to play baseball with the black kids, black and white children playing ball together in the Florida sun. That was Rosewood before, a place where for a while something like ordinary human coexistence actually seemed to hold, but it was holding on top of a volcano. Because this was Florida in the early 1920s, and Florida in the early 1920s had one of the highest rates of lynching of black men anywhere in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan was in the middle of a nationwide resurgence, marching openly in the streets. The entire South ran on a foundation of racial terror, on the ever-present threat that at any moment, over any accusation, a black person's life or a black community's existence could be extinguished with total impunity by a white mob. The peace in Rosewood was real, but it was permission, not right, and permission can be revoked in a single morning. That morning came on the first day of 1923. On the morning of January 1st, 1923, in the white town of Sumner, a young white woman named Fannie Taylor was heard screaming in her home. A neighbor rushed over and found her beaten, and Fannie Taylor said that she had been assaulted, attacked, and by some accounts raped by a black man who had fled out her back door. Now, I have to tell you what the evidence strongly suggests actually happened, because it is central to the whole tragedy and because the official 1993 state of Florida investigation into the massacre took it seriously. According to multiple accounts, including that of Sarah Carrier, a black woman from Rosewood who worked as Fannie Taylor's laundress and was there that morning, the person seen leaving Fannie Taylor's house was not a black stranger. It was a white man, very possibly a lover, with whom Taylor was having an affair. And the widely held conclusion of survivors and historians is that this white man was the one who beat Fannie Taylor, and that she invented the story of a black assailant to cover up the affair and explain her injuries to her husband. In other words, the entire catastrophe that followed, the deaths, the burning, the destruction of an entire town, was very likely built on a lie told by a white woman to hide an affair. This was not incidental. This was the engine. Because the false accusation of a black man assaulting a white woman was, in this era, the single most reliable trigger for racial violence in America, a match that white mobs across the country were always waiting to be struck. It had destroyed black lives and black communities again and again. And on January 1st, 1923, it was about to destroy Rosewood. Fannie Taylor's husband James gathered a mob of armed white men. Word spread that the assailant must be an escaped black convict named Jesse Hunter, a man who was never found, whose involvement was never established, who may have had nothing to do with anything. But the phantom of Jesse Hunter was all the mob needed. With bloodhounds, they set out from Sumner toward Rosewood hunting. The dogs led them first to the home of a black man named Aaron Carrier at the edge of Rosewood. The mob dragged him out of his house and prepared to lynch him on the spot. He was saved, barely, only because the county sheriff, Elias Walker, intervened and took him away into protective custody. Aaron Carrier survived, but the mob's blood was up, and they kept hunting. And then they came upon a man named Sam Carter. Sam Carter was a black blacksmith riding in his wagon. The mob seized him and demanded he tell them where the fugitive was hiding, a fugitive Sam Carter almost certainly knew nothing about. When he could not give them the answer they wanted, a member of the mob shot Sam Carter in the face at point-blank range, and then they hanged his body from a tree and left it there as a warning to every other black person in the region. Sam Carter was the first person murdered at Rosewood. It was still only the first day. For 2 days after that, an uneasy, terrible quiet held. Perhaps it was the weather. Perhaps the mob was regrouping and spreading rumors, but in Rosewood the families understood that they were in grave danger, and they began to gather together for safety. Many of them went to the home of Sarah Carrier, the laundress, the woman who knew the truth about Fannie Taylor. Her son, a man named Sylvester Carrier, was there, and he urged people to come together, believing there would be safety in numbers. Women and children sheltered inside the Carrier house. On the night of Thursday, January 4th, a mob of white men, 30 of them, descended on the Carrier home. And here it is worth pausing on what the historians have concluded about why they targeted that specific house. Because Sarah Carrier was the witness. She was the one who knew that a white man, not a black one, had been at Fannie Taylor's that morning. The attack on the Carrier home was not random. It was, in the assessment of researchers who mapped the mob's movements, a deliberate move to silence the people who could expose the lie at the heart of the whole thing. The mob arrived at the house. They shot the family dog, and when Sarah Carrier came to her porch to face them, they shot and killed her. Sarah Carrier, the laundress who knew the truth, murdered on her own porch. And then Sylvester Carrier did what almost no one in that time and place dared to do. He fought back, with his mother dead and women and children huddled inside his home. Sylvester Carrier took up arms and defended the house against the mob. In the gun battle that followed, he killed 2 of the white attackers and wounded 4 more before he himself was killed. 2 white men dead, shot by a black man defending his family. In the racial logic of 1923 Florida, there was no more incendiary fact imaginable, and the word of it went out across the countryside like fire on gasoline, because now it was not just a manhunt. Now it was a war. In the minds of the white mobs, black men had killed white men and had to be answered, and so they came. Not dozens now, but hundreds. As many as 200 or more white men poured into the region from surrounding towns, many of them Klansmen. A lawless army with a single purpose, to destroy Rosewood and everyone in it. And over the following day, from January 4th through January 7th, that is exactly what they did. They burned Rosewood to the ground, not in a single fire, methodically, building by building. They burned the homes, the ones that black families had built and owned and painted and kept neat for generations. They burned both churches. They burned the businesses. They burned the Masonic Hall. They moved through the town, and they put it to the torch house by house by house until the place that 200 people had called home was reduced to ash and chimneys and ruin. This was not a riot in the sense of chaos. The historians who studied it concluded that the destruction was systematic and premeditated. They were not just attacking Rosewood, they were erasing it, and the people of Rosewood ran for their lives. On freezing January nights, entire families fled their burning homes and disappeared into the surrounding swamps. The only place the mob would not easily follow, women and children, many of them in their nightclothes, some with no shoes, waded and hid in the cold black water and the palmetto scrub, listening to the gunfire and watching the glow of their town burning against the night sky. One survivor, who was a small girl at the time, remembered it simply. We didn't have no clothes, no shoes, no nothing. Some found shelter in the home of a white store owner named John Wright, one of the few white people in the area who tried to protect black residents rather than hunt them. And in the middle of that horror, there was one act of quiet rescue that saved many lives. In the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, January 6th, around 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 white brothers, trained men named John and William Bryce, brought a train through Rosewood. Working quickly and quietly in the near freezing dark, they loaded black women and children aboard, and they carried them away to safety, to depots across North Florida, to Otter Creek, to Archer, to Gainesville, to Fernandina Beach. Those women and children got out, and the descendants of the people on that train are alive to this day, living in those towns precisely because 2 railroad men decided on a freezing night to do the right thing. But the cruelty was not finished, because after the worst of it, a man named James Carrier, Sarah's son, Sylvester's brother, came out of the swamp where he had been hiding to perform the most human act imaginable, to bury his murdered mother and his murdered brother. And while he was completing that solemn task, the mob returned. They seized James Carrier. They forced him to dig his own grave, and then they lynched him and buried him beside the family they had already killed. Through all of it, the authorities did nothing. The local sheriff and the governor of Florida, Kerry Hardy, were aware of what was happening. They refused to send help. They refused to call out the National Guard. The state of Florida stood by and let a white mob spend a week annihilating one of its own towns. By January 8th, it was over. Rosewood was gone. The black residents had scattered to the winds, and not one of them ever returned to live there. The town was simply wiped off the map. And then came the final insult, the one that turned a massacre into a permanent injustice. No one was ever punished. A grand jury convened the next month in February 1923 and declared that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges against anyone. Not one person was ever arrested, tried, or convicted for the murders at Rosewood or for the destruction of the town. The coroner who examined Sam Carter, shot in the face and hanged in front of witnesses, ruled that he had been killed by unknown parties. Everyone knew, no one was charged. The erasure was now official, and that is where the story of Rosewood would have ended, and very nearly did end forever. Not with the fire, but with the silence that came after. Because here is the second erasure, the one that makes Rosewood almost unique among American atrocities. The survivors did not talk about it, not to journalists, not to historians, not even in most cases to their own children. Think about how strange and how devastating that is. Black American families have one of the richest traditions of oral history in the country, the passing down of stories of memory of who we were and what we endured from grandparent to grandchild. But the survivors of Rosewood broke that tradition deliberately out of a terror that never left them. One survivor, Robbie Morton, was 7 years old when her father put her on a train out of the area to save her life. Her grandmother forbade the family from ever speaking of where they came from. Her reasoning, as Morton remembered it, was chillingly practical. She felt like maybe if somebody knew where we came from, they might come at us. Another survivor, Minnie Lee Langley, kept the story from her own children for 60 years. I didn't want them to know what I came through, she said, and I didn't discuss it with none of them. 60 years of silence, an entire town, dozens of dead, a massacre locked away inside the survivors because they had learned the most terrible lesson America could teach them, that if you spoke about what was done to you, they might come and finish the job. The fear was so total that it succeeded where even the fire could not. It buried the memory. Sarah Carrier's husband, Haywood, who had been away on a hunting trip and came home to find his wife, his son, and his brother all murdered and his home burned. He was so unhinged by grief that he would wander off alone, sometimes with no clothes, talking only to himself until he died within a year. The trauma did not end when the fires went out. It rippled down through the survivors and their descendants for generations, a heaviness passed from parent to child alongside the silence. And so Rosewood disappeared. Not just the town, the knowledge of it. For 60 years it was as if it had never existed at all, until one journalist would not let it stay buried. In 1982, an investigative reporter named Gary Moore, working for the St. Petersburg Times, went looking for the truth of what had happened at Rosewood. And he did the patient, careful, respectful work of persuading the aging survivors to finally break their silence. And they did. Slowly, one by one, the people who had fled through the swamps as children began to tell what they had carried alone for 6 decades. The story reached national television, and it reached the children and grandchildren of Rosewood, some of whom were learning for the first time the full truth of where their families had come from. And then those descendants did something extraordinary, led by a man named Arnett Doctor, the son of a survivor and inspired by the reparations that the United States government had recently paid to Japanese Americans. Wrongly imprisoned during World War II, the survivors and descendants of Rosewood decided to demand justice from the state of Florida. They argued correctly that the state's own officials, not a sheriff as governor, had stood by and allowed the massacre to happen. In 1993, the Florida legislature commissioned a team of historians from Florida State, Florida A and M, and the University of Florida, led by Professor Maxine Jones, to investigate. They produced a 100-page report documenting the truth of what had happened, and crucially, their case was corroborated by a white witness, a man named Ernest Parham, who, as an 18-year-old store clerk, had witnessed the lynching of Sam Carter, and who now confirmed on the record what the black survivors had been saying all along. And on May 4th, 1994, the state of Florida did something no legislative body in the United States had ever done before. Governor Lawton Childs signed the Rosewood Compensation Bill into law. The state awarded roughly $2 million, $150,000 to each of the 9 survivors still living, additional compensation to descendants who had lost family property, and, most enduringly, a scholarship fund to send the descendants of Rosewood to Florida's state colleges and universities tuition-free forever. It was the first time in American history that a legislative body had paid reparations to black Americans for an act of racial violence. The special master who reviewed the case admitted that it would probably never have survived in an ordinary court of law, but he appealed instead to what he called the moral obligations of the state, and the legislature agreed. Rosewood, the town America had tried to erase twice, had become a landmark, the first crack in the Great Wall of American reparations. The last known survivor of the Rosewood Massacre, a woman named Mary Hall Daniels, who had fled the burning town as a 3-year-old and never once returned, lived to see her community finally acknowledged. She died in 2018. So where does that leave Rosewood? A town that no longer exists on a rural road with a single marker. It leaves it in the end as something its destroyers could never have imagined, because since 1994, nearly 300 descendants of Rosewood have used that scholarship to earn college degrees, including, in one family, a doctorate in pharmacy. Think about what that means. The mob that came to Rosewood in 1923 wanted to reduce a proud, prosperous, educated black community to ash and terror and silence. They wanted the story to end with a scared child fleeing through a freezing swamp in the dark. And instead, 100 years later, the story does not end there at all. It continues with graduation robes and diplomas, and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those swamp children walking across stages to accept degrees paid for by a state that was finally forced to admit what it had allowed to happen. They burned the town. They tried to burn the memory. They very nearly succeeded at both. But the truth of Rosewood survived in the silence of the survivors until the silence could finally be broken, and then in the record and in the law and in the descendants who refused to let it be forgotten. They tried to erase Rosewood twice, the place and the memory, and instead they made it unforgettable, a name that now stands for both the depth of what America did and the possibility, however late and however incomplete, of America being made to answer for it. There is nothing left on that road but a marker. But stop if you ever pass it and read it, because a whole world stood there once, and its people and their children and their children's children made sure that the world would finally know its name.